This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare offers thousands of inspiring classes for creatives, not just on photography, but on topics including illustration, design, video, freelancing, and more. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 2-month free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. It is finally here, the Fujifilm X-T4. The X-T3, which I have right here, was one of my favorite cameras that I tested last year, and I didn't have a whole lot to complain about the camera, but Fuji for some reason decided to release the X-T4 less than a year and a half after the launch of the X-T3, and apparently according to Fuji, they're treating this as more of a separate thing, not exactly a direct replacement for the X-T3. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but as you can see, these two cameras look very similar, and they both share the same 26 megapixel sensor and the same processor and the same autofocusing system, but that's about where the similarities end. Fuji has finally put the in-body stabilization on this camera, and they also developed a brand new battery just for this camera, and because of that they have made the body slightly bigger, not by much, just slightly thicker, and the grip has also become a little larger. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a positive or a negative thing, but some people might prefer the bigger grip. And the weight of the camera hasn't really changed either, and it's only just about a few grams heavier than the X-T3, and the bigger difference you'll feel are gonna come from the bigger battery. And once you put a lens on the camera, you probably won't really notice much difference. And perhaps a little more controversial is the rear LCD screen. And the X-T4 now has this fully articulating screen that flips out to the side and towards the front. And I've already voiced my opinions about this. I normally prefer this type of screen when I'm shooting videos, and I prefer the X-T3 screen for shooting stills. But that's just my personal preference, and everyone's different, obviously. Some people like fully articulating screens like this because it makes it easier to shoot portraits below eye level, but the X-T3 already had a unique screen that could flip out to the side like this, so it didn't really matter. But overall, both screens are functional, and it's not really a big deal, and obviously you can't always get what you want, can you? What I don't understand though is why didn't Fujifilm just make this the X-H2, because the X-H1 already had a body big enough to house the bigger battery and the Ibis and so on. And it's also much older than the X-T3, so it was more due for an upgrade. But for some reason they decided to leave that behind and update the X-T3 first. My only guess is that with the growing demands of vloggers and hybrid shooters, they still wanted to make the X-T4 their flagship camera, the one camera that can do everything, instead of updating the X-H1, making that camera better than the X-T3. But now it'll be also interesting to see what they do with the X-H2 if they ever release that camera, because now that the X-T4 has Ibis and bigger battery, I assume they're not going to make the X-H2 any better than this, so I don't know how they're going to differentiate them. It would have been really interesting if they made the X-T4 and the X-H2 exactly the same, but just with a different body, and if they gave this screen to the X-H2 and the same X-T3 screen on the X-T4, I think that would have been an interesting combination of cameras. But let me know in the comments which screen you prefer and why. Now, if you compare the hardwares in a more detail, and like I said, apart from the rear screen, not a whole lot has changed, and the back screen actually got a nice bump in the resolution from 1 million dots to 1.6 million dots. And when I'm just normally using the cameras, I couldn't really tell the difference, and you know, my visions aren't that great, so it didn't really affect my use in any way. But when I zoom in all the way in these 26 megapixel images, I could actually see the difference in sharpness. So on the new screen, it's a little little easier to tell if you've nailed your focus 100%. And apart from that, the back looks pretty much the same, except they moved around the buttons a little bit, and they moved the Q button to the top right corner here. And I like this change. I don't really know what the reasoning for that was, but I like this because the Q button, I know that on some of the previous cameras like the X-T3, some people complained that it was too easy to press them by accident, and I like how it's kind of out of the way here. And although the Q menu is useful, it's not something I use all the time, so it's nice that it's not right in the middle of the camera. And on the top of the camera, the top dials are mostly the same, but now the metering mode dial has become the stills and movie mode switch. To get into the movie mode on the X-T3, you had to do it on the drive mode dial, which was kind of confusing. And on some cameras without the physical dial for the drive mode, like on the X100V or the X Pro 3, you had to select it on the menu on the rear screen, which I always thought was kind of weird. So it's nice to have a dedicated switch for stills and movies, and when you switch back and forth, your settings are also saved. So it's nice that you don't have to always worry about turning the dials back to where they were every time you switch back and forth. One other small change on the top of the camera, the function button that used to be between the shutter speed dial and the exposure compensation dial has been moved to the front side of the camera next to the shutter button. And I'm actually not a huge fan of this new placement because it sits so flush to the surface and it's so close to the exposure compensation dial, and it's very hard for my finger to press it down, and I don't get any feedback when I press the button. So like what I'm doing is I'm just generally pushing hard down in that area, hoping something would happen on the back screen. So I wish they made the top plate a little bigger so they can push the button a little more forward. Also, with the bigger grip, I do wish the shutter button was also moved more towards the front, because it's still in this very upright position and my finger never knows if it needs to be behind the strap or in front of the strap, and this thing is always in the way. And I first noticed this on the X-T3 when I switched from the X-T2, but for some reason on the X-T4 it's bothering me a little bit more. The SD card compartment door is now removable, which might be useful for some video shooters who would put this camera in cages. And another change that's probably not as popular, they got rid of the 3.5mm headphone jack, and you can still plug in your headphones with a USB dongle, or you can get a battery grip which has the headphone jack, which is kind of weird if you think about it, because now that the X-T4 has a bigger battery, so you don't have to get a battery grip, but then now you still have to get a battery grip because you need a headphone jack. But overall, I like the body design, and I've always liked the body design, and I like the bigger body and the grip. And there are some things I think they can improve on the next generation, but the overall positives far outweigh the negatives, so I don't think it's gonna be a big deal. Moving on to the internals, the shutter actually has been updated, and the life expectancy of the shutter has been doubled from 150,000 actuations to 300,000 actuations on the X-T4, and the sound is actually a lot quieter, which is nice. Let me show you the difference. That's the X-T4. And here's the X-T3. It's pretty obvious. You still get that nice crunchy feeling and the feedback, but the sound is just a lot quieter. The mechanical shutter can now shoot up to 15 frames per second, up 4 frames from 11 frames per second on the X-T3. And although 11 frames per second is already pretty amazing, I think if you shoot a lot of actions or fast-moving objects, I think that extra 4 frames can make a difference. Or you can shoot with the electronic shutter up to 20 frames per second or up to 30 frames per second in the crop mode in 20.9 megapixels. Like I said, with the same sensor and the processor, the image quality is pretty much unchanged. It would have been exciting to see a new sensor, but this is still one of the best APS-C sensors on the market, and the colors are as great as ever. And yes, it's still not quite at the same level as some full-frame cameras cameras in high ISO performance, but you know, that's just the nature of being a crop sensor, and as long as you stay under ISO 6400 or so, I think you'll be happy with your images. But one thing I did notice though, although the X-T3 and the X-T4 share the same autofocusing system, when it comes to tracking subjects, I think the X-T4 does a slightly better job. It seems to stick to the subjects a little bit better, and I noticed the interface is actually slightly different. On the X-T3, there used to be these green squares that would light up around the subjects, but on the X-T4, there's one square that would just literally stick to the subject and it would just continue to follow. While shooting video, the X-T4's autofocus tracking may not be as responsive and accurate as Sony's and Canon's, but it's actually getting pretty close. For casual video shooters like me, I don't think I'll have any issue using the X-T4 as my only hybrid camera. The Ibis, although I think it would be much more useful for video shooters, it's obviously never a bad thing to have. Based on my testing while using a non-stabilized lens, I was able to get about 50 to 75% hit rate while shooting at half a second, and while shooting at full second, my hit rate was down to about 30%, which is still pretty good. For shooting video, obviously don't expect a gimbal-like performance, but it is a million times better than not having anything. In addition to the sensor stabilization, there's also the digital stabilization that you can apply on top of that, and then there's the boost mode, and as you go higher, you have to pay a bit of the penalty with the crop, but when you're shooting in 4K, it shouldn't be a huge deal, I guess. And the battery obviously is another big upgrade on the X-T4, and the new battery has about 80% higher capacity than the old one, and you should be able to expect at least about 50 up to about 100% increase in battery life depending on your shooting style. It's not exactly an apples to apples comparison with the X-T3 though, because it now has 3 separate boost modes along with the normal and economy mode, and of course the X-T4 also has the Ibis. The boost mode, like on the X-T3, improves the autofocus performance, but there are 2 additional modes on the X-T4 that also controls the resolution and the frame rate of the EVF and the rear LCD screen. Theoretically, the economy mode should be able to give you about 20 to 25% increase in battery life compared to any of the boost modes, which isn't that much if you think about it, so I think I'm just gonna keep mine in the boost resolution priority mode all the time. So back to the age-old question, should you buy one? Well, I think the main deciding factor for a lot of people right now is going to be choosing between this and the X-T3, because the X-T3 right now is $500 cheaper. So although the X-T4 is obviously objectively the better camera here, you're going to have to ask yourselves these questions. How much do you really need the Ibis and the bigger battery and also the fully articulating screen? And if you do want them, is it worth paying the extra $500 for them? And also at $1,700, this is not a cheap camera by any means, and for the same price you can get a full frame camera like the Sony a7 III or the Canon EOS R, or you can get an EOS RP for like almost half of the price. But then again, if you're someone who cared about full frame cameras, you probably wouldn't be looking at Fuji. Obviously there are no right or wrong answers for these, but to me personally, I feel like I could literally go either way. If I were looking for one camera that could do everything, my stills camera that can also shoot my YouTube videos with, the X-T4 is obviously the right choice. It has the fully articulating screen, which I use all the time on my Canon cameras, although I still like the X-T3's screen for shooting stills. If I had to choose one camera that can do everything, the X-T4 would be it. Also, if you're more of a video shooter than a still shooter in general, I think I would recommend the X-T4 more. But because I'm not looking for a camera like that, I might just stick with the X-T3 for now. I don't really need a camera that can do everything, and I still really like the X-T3 as what it is, and like I said, the image quality will be basically identical. The autofocus performance is not too far behind. For shooting stills, I don't always need the Ibis. I don't shoot a lot with slower shutter speeds, and the battery life, you know, it's not a huge deal. I get like 350 shots out of these batteries, and I have collected so many of these Fuji batteries over the years, and I also like the fact that I can share the same battery with my other Fuji cameras like the X100V. So if I were to choose a new camera today, I would just go with the X-T3 and spend my extra $500 on a lens or something. But like I said, that's just me and there's no right or wrong answers here. You're gonna have to make these decisions yourself. I'd like to quickly take this moment to thank our sponsor Skillshare, who made this video possible. If you are interested in not only finding the right camera for you, but also in improving as a photographer or a videographer, Skillshare has thousands of great classes that can help you do just that. I particularly enjoy the series called Street Photography: Capture the Life of Your City by Trashhand, a Chicago-based photographer. It's always interesting to hear how other street photographers capture the cities they live in. So that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you for watching, and if you have any more questions about these cameras, feel free to leave a comment down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.